Greeting, friends. Pastor Steve here, working with Leading With A Limp, Chapter 13. The risks of admitting you're the chief sinner, this idea of being able to be honest as a leader. I shared with the group, I'm not overly crazy about the title of the book, Leading With A Limp. It's fitting, it's apt, it fits what the author's trying to get at. But when I try and kind of translate it into what makes sense for me, and particularly what makes sense in more secular leadership settings, is just being an honest leader and not pretending we're more than we are, and being honest about our weaknesses, being honest about our successes, being honest that we've learned a lot, being honest that we've been broken and that God's helped us heal up. Just that honesty component. If a leader's honest, then the people we're leading, they can be honest too. If we're not honest, hope is gone for your organization to be honest as they face challenges. So just kind of little 2 cents worth about how things look overall for me. He talks in this chapter about, why admit your failures publicly? Why not cover up? Why not pretend? Why not just ignore and pretend, hope no one's aware of what's happening? He says, well, first, admitting your failures publicly invites others to look more honestly at their own need for freedom, forgiveness, and courage. And it also removes this dividing wall of hierarchy and false assumptions about people in power, that people in power are always right, always perfect, can never be questioned. No, that's not true. And then if we're humble, honest leaders, actually Scripture talks about this. 1 Peter says, if we humble ourselves, God lifts us up. Scripture is also very clear that if we lift ourselves up and aren't honest about our weaknesses and our failings and our brokenness, God will humble us. And so we want to humble ourselves and let God lift us up. It's important to be honest as a leader. He talks about how to embrace honesty. He talks about giving up the obvious. Great sentence. Trying to hide certain things about yourself is like trying to hide your face. I mean, everybody knows that I work with. They know my personality, my skills, what I'm good at. They know what I'm not so good at, and they know my weaknesses. And they know when I fail. I can't hide that. They already know it. So just give up the obvious. Everybody knows. Then he talks about telling some but not all. And this is something that I and other people have had to learn over time. This is when we talk about our failures, our brokenness. We don't necessarily have to go into great detail. That may or may not be helpful for people listening. But that we're broken or that we have a weakness, that we failed, that we need help, that's helpful. So some detail enough, but not too much. And then really important, and in secular leadership settings, this advice can't be given, but we're honest so we can embrace the gospel. Because the good news of Jesus is about forgiveness and restoration. It's not just about, I'm going to grow and learn through this. That's true, that happens. But when we fail, we need to be forgiven and we need to be restored. And those are things that happen only in relationship with God. God makes those things happen. So that's great reasons to embrace honesty. Everybody else knows the truth anyway. Be honest enough. You don't have to tell all the details. Be honest, and then it brings us toward forgiveness and restoration that God's at work in our lives. So a lot of good news in being honest. He talks about the paradox of grace, or God's kindness to us that's working in our life right now. First of all, there's this already and not yet. Very important in actually New Testament studies about how God's at work in the world, but important in this leadership study. He talks about in Jesus Christ we have been saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved. So it's not done yet. Everybody's in process. Everyone's in process. So I have a right to expect more out of my leadership capabilities 35 years in as a pastor than I did 5 years in. But I'm still in progress. I'm still learning. There's lots left to learn. And I have to look at everyone I work with. We're all in progress. No one has arrived. We're on a trip of growth and maturity, and I am too. And it's a great culture to be able to work in. He talks about strength and tenderness, that Jesus has both. God's strong with us. He's also tender with us. If God was just strong, we'd just feel fear and condemnation all the time. If God was just tender, we'd never grow up. We'd never learn. We'd just keep failing and failing and failing. But no, he's strong and tender, and that combination helps us grow up. He also talks about the importance of being wise and innocent, and he quoted in the book one of my favorite chapters in the New Testament because I found it incredibly helpful. Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And that's Jesus talking. Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And he talks about employing cunning for the sake of redemption is not the same as using manipulation to achieve one's ambitions. So when I'm wise and innocent in leading, I'm using all my acquired knowledge and skill and information to help move a person or organization to where it needs to be for the greater good, not for my personal benefit, but for the good of the people I'm leading and for the good of the mission, for the good of the organization. And I just share this personal example because it just jumped out at me as I was reading the chapter. When my mom had full hip replacement surgery, maybe it's been 4 years ago now, probably. I said, hey, Mom, how about if we come out to Denver, my wife and I, we can stay with you and bring you to the hospital and bring you back home the next day and stay with you for a day and we'll head home. She said, no, that won't be necessary. I have someone who's going to drop me off at the hospital and someone will pick me up when I get home and it will be fine. I'll be fine. I won't need any help. Well, I've dealt with enough people with hip replacements in my life as a pastor. I go, no, she's not going home by herself. It won't work. The doctor may let her, but it won't be good. So how do you be as shrewd as a snake, wise as a snake, as innocent as a dove? A couple days before her surgery, I said, Mom, called her up, would you do me a favor? Sure, Steve. Can Tara and I come out and just bring her to the hospital and maybe stay a day after surgery? She said, well, okay. So we went out, brought her to the hospital, brought her home. I stayed for 4 or 5 days. My wife stayed for an additional week. And months later, I was talking to my mother about this. She's fiercely independent, which I think is great. I appreciate that about her. She said to me on the phone, you knew that I would need help, didn't you? And I said, yes, Mom, I did. Wise as a snake, innocent as a dove, all for her benefit, not for my benefit. So how do we pull that off in our leadership? Great discussion questions today. We talked about the already and the not yet. And we talked about the first section we talked about, if as a leader, all we do is tell the stories about how we succeed. Oh, I did that right. Oh, I succeeded. I led us successfully through that. It's like we're fully saved. Then no one can tell their stories of weakness, can they? They have to hide them over. Or if a leader only tells stories of failure, the followers will go, we can't follow this person. They've never done anything right. Of course, those are extremes. So we talked about what types of stories do you tend to tell with people that you work with? Success? Failure? Mixture? How does that work out? Do you hesitate to tell stories of when you failed? Made a mistake? Why? Or do you hesitate to tell stories of success? Why? And everyone's life experience is incredibly different in this. I actually have had to learn to tell stories of success because my father's example for me, who in his ministry career as a pastor was interesting, full of a lot of success in many different ways. He worked as a pastor, he worked as a denominational executive, he was a conference superintendent, but he never, bragged is the wrong word, but never talked about what he had achieved or the success that God enabled him to do. So as an adult in my mid-40s, I got, wow, I feel bad telling my story of when God's enabled me to do something well. What was wrong with that? That's a false humility. So I've had to learn. You may struggle, on the other hand, with, I can't tell stories about failure because leaders never fail. Well, of course they do, don't they? Leaders fail all the time. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. We bring people along with us. But we talked about those things, and we talked about the difference between, let's say, a workplace where it's expected that everyone in whatever position they're in has arrived at their full potential right now already, versus a workplace where everybody knows we're all in process. We're all growing, we're all learning. There's weaknesses, there's failures, but we're learning, we're growing together. What a different kind of work environment. We're able to be honest about what's really happening in our lives. Secondly, we talked about strengths and weaknesses. And when we're leading people, do we lean toward strength or do we lean toward tenderness? And think about how you're working with people. What's your kind of initial lead in? You lead with tenderness because high relationality, or you lead with strength. This is what we need to do. This is what's going to happen. It's going to get the job done. And we talked about, is there somebody in our life who's showed us tenderness with the strength needed, not to just to give in to what we wanted, but really to lead us, but in a tender way that we could actually follow. And some stories are shared at the table. And then give an example of when a leader was both strong and tender with you. And I think in my life experience, leaders who have done that have had the most impact on me. I remember a committee meeting back in a previous church with the lay people responsible for dealing with pastor, and in this church it's called the Staff Parish Relations Committee. In that church it's called by a different name. But there was an annual evaluation, and how to help us keep growing and learning, and actually one of my friends was on that committee, and one of the things that came up, feedback on me from other staff, is I never said thanks. I didn't thank people. And that came out, and my friend was giving this feedback to me in the context of the committee, and I remember wanting to defend myself and saying, but people just do their job. Like, for instance, at that point in my life, I never expected to be thanked. I just do my job. That's what you do. Well, that's true, but being thankful is actually an important thing. I learned that, but my friend looked at me and said, Steve, you need to learn to say thank you to the people that you work with. And he talked about how he had learned that at his workplace. And he managed a lot of people. I said, okay. He was tender with me, but he was serious. He was strong. And because I knew he was tender with me and in my best interest at heart, I took his advice to heart and actually changed my behavior at work, which needed to. I needed to learn that. So strength and tenderness, how does that work with you? We talked about wise and innocent. Is it really possible to be crafty and wise, yet also be committed to the other person's good? And that's where we as leaders got to be so careful, because in our culture, great leadership is sometimes equated with manipulation. I'm going to get this group of people to do what I want them to do. Well, that's not being wise and innocent. A wise and innocent leader they're cunning, they're shrewd, but they have the other person's best interest at heart and the good of the mission. They're not trying to get something out of it for themselves. And then we tried to talk about, was there some time in life when someone did that toward you? They were crafty and wise, and you needed it at that time to keep growing. Because there's a danger if leaders in our lives have always been strong, that we're not free to be honest about our weaknesses or failings or concerns, or if we've only had leaders who have been, innocent or tender, we'll never make any progress. So, great chapter just about being a leader and actually being a person, being able to be honest. Honest with God, honest with yourself, honest with family members, honest at work. And if we set that kind of leadership example, then guess what? Everybody else gets to be honest. And we can make it through just about anything together. So, chapter 13. Next week, chapter 14. Really good chapter about the three kinds of leaders everybody needs: prophet, priest, and king. And we'll talk about how that works in an organization, and also just in how we hope to combine some of that in us as a single leader. So, chapter 14, enjoy that. Catch you next week.